I guess I'll start then. First of all, thanks so much, folks, for joining. My name is Bill Armstrong, and I'm the founder and CEO at Neversecond. Very pleased to be presenting today our webinar entitled Fueling for Your Spring Marathon. Some of you may be wondering where Oscar is today. Oscar had some commitments, but we have a fantastic guest joining us today, Ms. Alexandra Cook, joining us from UK. Before we get into the presentation, I just wanted to say thanks so much, Alex, for joining. Really, you're an expert in the field of running and nutrition, so we're very lucky to have you be joining us today. So thanks for that.
My pleasure.
Excellent. And also on the call, we have Lauren Armstrong, my wife, and also the operational head at Neversecond. So thanks for joining as well, Lauren.
Thank you.
Okay, what I'll do is I'm just going to share screen and we can dive right into the presentation. Bear with me just a second. Okay. Here we are. Ta-da, here we are. Okay. As I was saying earlier, this webinar is entitled How to Fuel for Your Spring Marathon. So if you're looking for a cycling webinar, you're in the wrong one. That comes next month. We'll be doing a little bit of forward looking. We'll be doing a webinar next month. We work with a lot of cyclists and gravel riders and mountain bikers, and we're really excited to be bringing that one to you next month, which is going to be about getting ready for a big gravel event. So really geared around unbound gravel. So be on the lookout for that. As I mentioned, earlier, we have with us Alexandra Cook. Alexandra Cook is joining us. She is a protege of Oscar Yeukendrup and is joining us from the UK. In our presentation today, should be about an hour 15 possibly. In the first portion, we're going to introduce Alex, and she's going to talk us through how to prepare for a spring marathon nutritionally. It's a critical component of performing your best. My background is as a runner. I can tell you I've had a lot of less than perfect races that came as a result of bad nutrition. Back eons ago when I used to race, this predated a lot of the expertise that is available today and the great products that are available today. But even today, it's pretty amazing. A lot of athletes still don't fuel correctly and usually pay the price as a result. The presentation will last around 30 minutes. After that, we'll open up the dialogue for a Q&A session. Feel free during the presentation to enter any questions that you have into the Q&A chat, and that we can address them as soon as the presentation completes. And then following the Q&A session, we're going to talk a little bit about what's coming in 2023, which we're really excited about. And then also provide some information and contact information for Alex and for Neversecond. So, Alex is a phenomenal consultant, works with a lot of athletes. And so for athletes that are looking for a little bit more of a personalized approach, we're going to provide her information as well, so you can get in touch directly. With that said, Alex, I'm going to let you talk a little bit about yourself. I know you don't necessarily love to talk about yourself, but maybe you could tell the audience a little bit about your background, which is both from a professional background as well as your running background.
I was hoping you were going to do that bit, Bill, but I will talk about
I can
myself.
I can do it.
I can. It's fine. So nice to meet you all. I'm Alex Cook. I'm a sports dietitian, and I specialize, as Bill said, in running. Well, endurance sports, but predominantly running. I studied at University of Birmingham with Oscar quite a few years ago. And that kind of ignited my passion, I think, for sports nutrition and performance nutrition. I am also a runner. And I think that's really valuable to the advice I give my athletes, because I've been running marathons for 22 years now. I did my first marathon when I was 19, and I'm 42 now, and I'm still doing them. And even though I'm experienced and I know the science, it still doesn't always go right for me either, because, it's a minefield. So, I run, I still do marathons, I do 5Ks, but I'm really excited. This is my favorite topic because I love helping athletes prepare their plans, but also I like experimenting with my own nutrition as well. So my favorite topic.
Pretty fast times there too, Alex. So by the way.
Both done when I was over 40, I might add.
Nice, very good, very good. I'll tell you, my first marathon, I was running marathons at a pretty young age. I can remember finishing and not remembering anything, literally passing out and going and waking up in an IV tent. So I'm sure at some point we can talk about that. I'm sure that was a fueling problem, probably.
Probably.
So let's dive right into to the subject. When we started putting together the presentation for this audience, I was really impressed with a lot of your insights, and so let's talk about this first slide a little bit, which talks about the idea that one size fits none. I mean, we're ultimately speaking about your experience and expertise as a nutritionist. Talk to us a little bit maybe about the differences in, I guess the barriers that exist for people, when they try and put together a nutrition plan for a marathon.
I mean, I think, especially these days, and compared to when you did your marathon running, Bill, where there was actually not a huge amount of information, not a huge amount of research available, 15, 20 years ago. But now we are literally faced and bombarded with information day in, day out. We hear what athletes are doing, we hear what our training partner's doing, we're reading what somebody's written in the media. So we're getting lots of information bombarded, but also you might find that everyone thinks that they're an expert themselves, because anyone that, puts food in their mouth and what they think works for them, they might preach and think that it's going to work for everyone else. But, we will talk today about the guidelines as to what you need to do to prepare your own nutrition plan or feeding strategy. But also it's really important, and my first message is that nutrition is highly personalized and it is very, very individual to you. So, we will talk about how we can personalize it, but that's a really important message.
So when we're going through today, I was just trying to think about, although it's highly personalized and a lot of folks work with you as a nutritionist, I'm assuming from today's talk we'll be able to kind of help most people with most of their issues. Is that kind of a fair statement?
Yeah, I think so. Hopefully that's the plan, and people will be able to sort of get some take-home messages and sort of work out sort of what might work for them and what won't.
Okay, sounds good to me. Let's dive in. This I found to be a fascinating slide. It was really broke down what are the major categories of problems that athletes have. Maybe you could walk us through a little bit of what are the major groupings of nutritional problems that athletes have in marathons.
I mean, I find, a lot of people, they'll think about their kits, they'll think about their training plan, but nutrition does tend to be probably one of the last things runners think about, or even think about at all. But, getting your nutrition right really is that fine line between sort of success and failure. And, if you don't get your nutrition right, then, it could lead to a bit of a disaster with your marathon, because you will run out of energy. You might get dehydrated. You might suffer gastrointestinal issues. So, the one common factor that's linking all these problems is your nutrition. So it's something that shouldn't be thought of sort of 4 weeks before the marathon. I get people messaging me sort of, I'm running the London Marathon in 4 weeks' time, can I talk to you about my fueling plan? Well, yeah, you can talk to me about your fueling plan for your next marathon, but talking about it sort of 3-4 weeks before is not going to help. So these are all the things here that, can happen to you, and dehydration, running out of energy, and GI issues could mean the end of your marathon if you suffer from any of them.
Would you say that, a lot of athletes, I mean, I don't know if it's still the same terminology, cyclists call it bonking, runners call it hitting the wall. Do you think most of this is avoidable with proper nutrition? I mean, is it something that most athletes could avoid?
I mean, nothing is guaranteed, right? You can't guarantee that even if, and I think we'll talk about this a little bit later, you know, even if you do have this perfect plan and perfectly practiced plan, you can't guarantee that it's still going to mean you're definitely going to get your PB. But, you know, if you are well practiced and you do know what you're going to do, then it kind of increases your chances of you succeeding and it working well. You know, sometimes it just might not be your day. But essentially all we can do is our best. And it's the same with training. You can train as hard as you can create your best, and then just hope for the day that it all comes together.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I can recall quite a number of bad days, and it wasn't always like an extreme, but sometimes it's about avoiding problems. The others, it's about performing your best, which I think is all, I would say a lot of the athletes, if not most of the athletes on this webinar are probably interested in. So.
And I think essentially it's really important to say that, you know, the marathon is a long way. So it's a long time for anything to go wrong. So, you know, it's about making sure that you sort of stay flexible as well. But I think we'll talk about that a bit later on.
Well, fantastic. That's you talked a little bit earlier this week about what are the fundamentals of a proper fueling plan. It looks to me like it boils down into ultimately three main subjects: the fuel portion, the fluid portion, and the practicing portion. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, it's essentially sort of that same message. You know, some questions you need to ask yourself. You know, am I fueled enough for running 26.2 miles? Am I hydrated enough for this event? And have I practiced enough? And I think that last one is probably the most important, is probably the last sort of most important point, you know, to make sure that you're getting those fundamentals. And they're the sort of fundamental questions you need to ask yourself before you start making your plan and putting your plan together.
It's interesting. When we started Neversecond, and there was, I came in from being an active athlete, but competitive as an endurance athlete, but not really having been away from the landscape for a while in terms of what people were doing. I was relatively surprised when we were getting a lot of calls from, whether it doesn't matter if it was a marathoner, ultra distance runners, triathletes, Ironman athletes, calling us 2 days before the event, making sure their shipment, the first time they were ever actually going to use our product, was arriving on course to use it that day. Obviously, we know that's not the way to go. It just was, it's something that just reinforces the necessity for reinforcing the message, which is that you really need to practice nutrition in advance to ensure a better, at least ensure a better outcome or mitigate the worst problems.
100%. And the more you practice, the more issues you will experience in those practice runs. And, you know, the more you'll be able to sort of face those problems during your race if they arise.
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, speaking of plans, so you've outlined a few steps to really kind of help create a roadmap for athletes to succeed. You know, a lot of athletes are focused on training, but they're not necessarily thinking about planning out for their event. What do you think in terms of, I guess the importance of a plan? How far before should an athlete really be doing that? Should it be, I mean, I guess we've talked about 8 to 12 weeks. Is that really the standard that we should be looking for? And what if somebody's not at 8? What if they're not, let's say they're in less than 8 weeks? How should they approach that?
I think, you know, that the longer you can practice, the better. But I'd say the majority of people aim, you know, have a marathon training plan that's at least sort of 12 weeks. So I think that's sort of when we sort of say between 8 to 12 weeks. You know, if you're doing maybe 2 or 3 marathons a year or 2 marathons a year, your marathon build-up might be slightly shorter. Mm-hmm. But I suppose, in my opinion, the further out you can start practicing, the better. Now, additionally, if this is your first marathon, which some of you it might be, some of you might be very experienced marathon runners. So again, it will be very different. So if you're new to marathon running, you might not know, well, do I want to use gels? Do I want to just use drinks? Do I just want to use bars? Or maybe none of them. Maybe you want to use real food. So that would be the first thing, you know, you would need to decide. And so you need to decide that sort of further out. So once you've decided on what your fuel is going to be, then you can start training with it. Also things like, are you going to use the brand that the marathon is using? So find out what brand they're using on the course. Are you going to use that? If so, then you start training with it. If not, you train with your own brand that you choose, and you make your own plan from that. Are you going to bring your own water? Are you going to use the water on the course? You know, if you're using water on the course, how often is the water going to be available? So these are all the things, when it says here, start thinking, you know, get all the information you need. That's what we mean by get the information you need. What fuel are you going to choose? Are you going to use what they're using at the marathon, or are you going to be independent? Okay. And then once you've done that, then you can define your targets and calculate your needs. And then that's what's going to be different for everyone. And that's what we're going to talk to you about now.
Okay, great. That's fantastic. Let's see here. Oops. Stumble on the screen there. I think this this chart that we created really helps people understand the importance. It looks like we've broken it down into 5 categories. You know, the time before, and then as you really start getting closer to the event, you really have to be thinking about what you're doing in these kind of increments of time. Could you maybe walk the audience a little bit through kind of the importance and how each of these periods of time relates to performance?
Yeah, so you obviously don't, you want to be starting your plan 8 to 12 weeks before, which is what we've just spoken about. Mm-hmm. Then, you know, you then decide what plan you're going to be doing 2 days before, what you're going to be eating 1 day before, what you're going to be eating the morning of your race, and then what your plan is for your race. We'll talk a little bit later on about sort of leading up to the race and probably that week before. But just so long you have in your mind sort of what your plan is going to be, then you can start executing that. And it really does need to be part of your training plan. You know, like triathletes might call nutrition as their 4th discipline. We don't really, in the running world, I can't really think of a way we can say similar, but it's the same thing. You know, it has to be just as important as your physio appointments, your sports massage, your training. And it just needs to coincide. So if that does mean for 8 to 12 weeks, you're a little bit more serious about your nutrition, then that's not a bad thing.
I have to say, one of the things I've noticed is in triathlon, especially Ironman, they live and die by their nutrition.
Yeah.
Cycling, it's extremely important as well, almost, I would say, almost with the same level of seriousness. And then the runners, historically, I just having known a lot of runners, there's this inherent, it's the simplicity of the sport. They're just kind of gritted out. So it's almost like mentally, a lot of runners just feel like they're going to tough it out and survive. And I always ask myself the question when I talk to certain runners who, even if they had a decent race, it's not a matter of, well, they had a good race that explains not using performance nutrition. It's how much better would they do if they actually used nutrition, right?
Mm-hmm. And I think also, you know, compared to cycling, you know, running, it is harder to fuel than if you are on a bike, because, you know, how do you carry it? You know, you have all this sort of mechanical movement of up and down. So there's a much higher risk of GI distress. If you're not used to it and you're new to it, the thought of taking on the gels or chewing a bar whilst you're running is a really alien concept. Yeah. So I think a lot of people probably would naturally avoid it rather than face the problem head on, because for sure, you could probably trot through a 3-hour run without taking anything on. You're not going to feel great, but you can do it. Mm-hmm. You're not going to do it to your best ability. But I do think that potentially that, you know, then people worry about needing the loo whilst they're out. So I think there's quite a lot of scare factors to fueling with running compared to maybe when you're on the bike.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah, absolutely.
Now, beyond the race itself, any races, whether it's a marathon or anything of an endurance distance, is always the focus. However, though, it is all about the training. Wouldn't you say, or do you recommend most training throughout the year, and all training, if it's an endurance base, you should be using something of a...
Yeah. And it's a really good point, Lauren, because I definitely, you know, with my own training, even if I'm not training for a marathon, anything over 90 minutes, I will definitely make sure I take at least 1 or 2 gels with me, because I want to make sure that my system and my gut is used to processing that carbohydrate whilst I run. Mm-hmm. So I think it's definitely a good practice once you have got a plan, once you have got a product that you like, actually using it. And, you know, we won't divulge into, you know, divulging away from the marathon too much. But, you know, it's things like maybe if you've got a faster speed session, you know, I will always take a gel with me on a speed session just in case I'm feeling a bit low. Because also it's good practice to be taking carbohydrates at a slightly higher intensity, which again, I'll mention in a slide later on, because that's ways of training your gut. So it is good to keep exposing your gut to taking on carbohydrate, because the more you do it, the more your body gets used to it and the easier it all becomes.
Right.
Yeah. I
think, so we've talked about the necessity of having a plan. And that was step 1. And now it's about, I think it's an important point to talk to the audience about, you know, a lot of athletes oftentimes confuse fueling and fluid. They interchange the ideas, and they kind of get mixed up and confused. Sure. I think it's important to note that we recommend calculating fueling first. Could you maybe talk a little bit about what you recommend for fueling for marathoners?
So fueling, when we talk about fueling, we're talking about carbohydrate, we're talking about energy. And obviously when we're talking about fluid, we're talking about purely hydration. So the first step we want to do is calculate your fueling needs. So calculating your energy needs, your carbohydrate needs. So this will mainly depend on the duration of your activity. But mainly we're looking at about 60 grams of carbohydrate an hour. But it also depends on your goal. So, you know, if you're someone that's running a marathon just to complete it, say for example, you know, you want to just get around and you're walking and you're jogging, your fueling needs are going to be different to someone that's competing and maybe trying to get around in like 2:30 or sub 3 hours. So, you know, again, this is where the independent individual advice comes from. You've got to think of what your goals and your aims are of the race. And then you can start working out what fuel you need per hour.
I love what you say here about competing versus completing, because that really is kind of like, it really summarizes it really well.
Yeah.
When you talk about a lot of athletes, like, you know, when going back over the last 20 years, you know, when as the intake standards have gone up to now this 90 grams an hour might seem staggering for some athletes. Can you maybe just talk a little bit about how we've landed at that number, and I guess what you would recommend for people in terms of, you know, some folks might be very competitive but are nowhere near 90 grams an hour. How do you suggest they possibly evaluate this, and how do they kind of approach it from a training the gut perspective? Just,
is that on our next slide, Bill?
It is coming up. Yeah, I was going to say we
okay.
hold off on that one.
So obviously, like, the science is constantly being revised, isn't it? And, you know, we're constantly finding out new things, which is the exciting thing about science, but also the difficulty when you're a practitioner like me, because things are constantly changing and moving. So, you know, we will go into why the 60 grams and 90 grams, what that actually means and how that came about. But, you know, you might find that those that are doing a faster marathon, but only running for 2.5, maybe 3 hours, 90 grams an hour might be more realistic for them compared to somebody that's maybe going to do 5-6 hours. 90 grams an hour is going to be pretty hard for 5-6 hours on the go. So pushing up to 90 grams an hour, you know, that's a lot of carbohydrate per hour, and that's going to take a lot of practicing, So again, you need to work out what you want to aim towards. And you would, you know, I wouldn't advise initially going, right, I'll do 90 and starting 90. You want to build up.
I mean, a lot of runners are taking, like, let's say nothing or a minimal amount. Where do they typically start in training? I mean, 30, 45, what would you recommend?
I would probably say if I had an athlete that didn't really take anything, I would start right from basic. You know, and building it up. You certainly wouldn't go from 0 to to 90, not even 0 to 60.
Okay.
You know, if we're looking at the Neversecond gels, you know, one gel is 30 grams of carbohydrate. So you might say, right, we'll try and take that over the hour. So you're just taking bit by bit rather than taking the whole thing at once, so that you're just increasing your tolerance over time.
Okay, that's great. That's great advice. I mean, it's come a long way even in the last 5 years, where I think a lot of the communication has been take a gel. And a lot of athletes were like better off than taking nothing. And what I think what we're really doing as a brand in our communication is trying to take athletes from take a gel, regardless of what's in it, to really elevating it to here's what the science says, here's what you should be able to work towards.
Yeah.
And we're giving you a system to kind of meet that goal.
Yeah.
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 Okay, moving along here. This is, I think, a really fascinating slide about what fuels a marathon. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the importance of carbohydrate.
Yeah, I love this slide because I think it's really basic, but it's actually really visual and a really good indication. You get a lot of confusion, I think, and I hear a lot of people talking to me about fat and fat adaptation, and you know how it's important that they're using fat when they're doing their marathon. And yeah, there's never this sort of classic point where you're just using fat or just using carbohydrate. Like no matter how fast you're running, there's going to be an aspect of using, you know, carbohydrate and fat. But as you can see from the graph, depending on the intensity of your running will depend on sort of what you're actually utilizing or using to produce that performance. So if you're looking at carbohydrate and fat, carbohydrate's always going to win because the body uses carbohydrate, it utilizes it and breaks it down to energy most easily compared to fat. So yes, we do use fat for energy, and we've got enough fat to fuel us probably tens of thousands of kilometers. But it's harder for your body to break that down and to utilize it as energy compared to carbohydrate. So you can see from this graph, you know, if you are walking, so you're going to be using carbohydrates at a higher intensity. So the higher intensity you're working, the more carbohydrate you're going to rely on. So if you can see from this graph, if you're running very fast, you're going to predominantly be using carbohydrate and some fat. If you're slow jogging, it might be sort of more 50-50. If you're walking, you'd be using more fat to carbohydrate. So that kind of indicates what I meant in the past, in the last slide, that are you competing or are you completing? And even if you're completing, you still need to take on carbohydrates, but you might not need to be taking on 90 grams of carbohydrates. You might be able to get away with taking a little bit less. But we do need to take on carbohydrate, and that's because we don't have endless stores of carbohydrate. We store carbohydrate as glycogen, but that is like a tank of petrol, essentially. And we have enough to maybe fuel us sort of an hour and a half to maybe 2 hours of exercise. And then after that, if we didn't replace it, as you were talking about, Bill, you hit the wall, or as in cycling terms, you bonk. So therefore, carbohydrate intake, getting it right before and during exercise will prolong your performance.
That's great. Super. So when athletes who are competing at an intense level, certainly competing, not completing, which is a lot of people that may be on this, this webinar, when they hear about fat adaptation, what would be your reply to that? As being like their preferred source or something like that? How would you respond to that?
I mean, there's a lot of information, and again, we don't want to digress too much because it's a topic we could digress on quite easily. But obviously, with marathon training, you will find people sort of talking about fasted training and to get more fat adapted. By trying to train on obviously no carbs or limited carb stores. But additionally, you know, if you're a long distance runner, you're going to be pretty well fat adapted anyway, naturally, from the amount of training that you're doing. So you know, maybe it would be another webinar, I'm sure you do at some point, where you can play around a bit with your carbohydrate intake around training. But essentially, I think a priority is to practice with the carbohydrate and train your body to utilize that carbohydrate during training. That's what's going to get you to perform at your best.
Okay, that's great advice. Oh, sorry, lost the screen here. 1 sec. Oh, yeah. There we are. So this is a chart that we circulate quite a bit as a brand. Maybe you could just talk the audience through it a little bit about kind of how we relate duration to intake per hour. And maybe you could also talk a little bit about, a lot of athletes come to us talking about, well, I'm heavier, I need more. I'm bigger, I need more. I'm male, I need more than women. You hear all sorts of opinions. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that with the audience.
Well, it is actually quite, compared to if we're talking about training nutrition and carbohydrate requirement for training, where we do actually, it does matter on sort of weight, because obviously we advise on grams per kilogram of body weight. So size does matter when we're talking about training, but this is actually, I'd say, almost slightly more of a simple science, because actually weight doesn't matter. We're not talking about grams per kilogram of body weight, and gender doesn't matter either. It's a general recommendation of grams per hour, and the limitation, which I think we talk about maybe in the next slide, is not we're not limited. If we gave our muscles 200 grams of carbohydrate, it would utilize and use it. So if we were to, obviously wouldn't be able to take 200 grams of carbohydrate an hour, but if we did provide our muscles with that, it would utilize it and use it. So it makes you say, well, what is the limiting factor? And the limiting factor that limits us at about sort of 60 or 90 grams per hour is intestinal absorption. So how much carbohydrate we take depends on how much we can absorb. And that's absorbing per hour.
Okay.
So if we have a look at the graph. Oh, okay.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, it skipped on us there.
No, that's okay. I didn't know if you wanted to talk about just down there when we were just looking at sort of how much grams per hour. Now we're talking about marathons, so we want to be sort of looking at the 2 hours, 2.5 hours plus. So generally, like we said, we've got the 60 to 90 grams per hour. That's what we want to be looking at. But also, I just wanted to make a little mention of the mouth rinse. And it's probably relatively common knowledge now that there's a good study that indicates that, if you swirl the sports drink around your mouth and spit it out, that there was an increase in performance. Now that's obviously not a physiological effect because you're swilling it and spitting it out, but there's a cerebral effect that can. So even if you do struggle in your marathon, perhaps if you have space around you and no other runners, even sort of taking the drink and swirling it around and spitting it out might be better than nothing.
Fantastic. The next slide, there we are, explains a little bit about the limitation that you were just referring to with intestinal absorption. Could you maybe walk the group a little bit through about the limitations and about, I guess, which is an introduction into multiple transportable carbohydrates? That would be great.
Yeah, so we were talking about the limit is the intestinal absorption rate. So that's how much our intestines can absorb the carbohydrate. And this kind of picture here shows obviously lots of people. So if we take the people as your carbohydrates, what we find is that if you're taking one type of carbohydrate, so glucose, and they're exiting to exit A, so that's also known as our transporter, which is SGLT1. And what we found is that actually gets saturated at about 1 gram a minute, so about 60 grams an hour of one type of carbohydrate. So the body can't actually absorb above that rate. So even if we took 80, 90 grams of glucose, we couldn't absorb anymore. So what would happen is it would sort of stay in the intestine and probably build up and cause some GI problems. So then study showed that actually there's another transporter, and as you can see here in exit B, the people can exit through the other one. So we're managing to get more people out or more carbohydrate absorbed into the system. But that carbohydrate needs to be a different type of carbohydrate. So for example, fructose or maltodextrin. And that is what then pushes the grams per hour up to 90. So we need to make sure that we're up to 60 grams through XSA. And if we're up to 60 grams there and we're adding in another carbohydrate, then we can push that up to 90 grams an hour. So we're actually getting more carbohydrate into the system. And that's the multiple transportable carbohydrates, which a lot of products do have, I'd say, these days. You're not going to get up to 90 grams with just one type of carbohydrate, but I guess that might be over to you, Bill, to sort of talk about that with the Neversecond products. Oh, there you go.
Well, I was going to say, a lot of athletes do ask us, like, what should I use? And I think it's important, before we dive into Neversecond's products and about how they all do use multiple transportable carbohydrates. We use 2-to-1 maltodextrin to fructose in our gels and drink mixes, and 2-to-1 glucose fructose in some of our new products that we'll be launching this year. But before I get into that, it would be interesting to, when we talk about, a lot of athletes say, well, what should I take? I mean, you've got chews, you've got gels, you've got drink mixes, of all different options. We could talk maybe a little bit about the practicality, I think, and I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
I think practicality is really important with marathon. I think if you're comparing to an ultra marathon, where you take, generally you've got your own hydration pack, you have a little more independence when you're running ultra marathons. Now, I know people do wear the hydration vests with marathons, but generally people that are running a faster marathon are not going to run with their own water and their own pack on. So practically, you've got to think what is going to work for you. How are you going to carry it? So that's why gels generally tend to be the go-to for marathon runners, because they're maximum energy in small volume. They're easy to tuck in. Like when I did my last marathon, I think I had my Neverseconds. I had one down my sports bra, 2 in my pockets, one in the pocket at the back. You can kind of tuck them into different places or into your arm sleeves. They're practical, and they provide you with what you want. So compared to some people, and actually I do see it a lot more regularly now, that people say, well, I want natural food, I want proper food, which is fine, but it's a lot more difficult to create a plan, when you're just eating normal food, because it's not as, we know on the package how many grams of carbohydrate we're going to get, so you can make a plan a lot more easily. And also composition matters. If you are running a faster marathon, trying to chew when you're running fast or running at intensity or marathon pace, especially if you're running, sub 3:30 or whatever, it's very hard if you've got a bar and you're trying to chew it through. So composition of what you choose matters. So drink might be easier, or the gel. And I think that's what you need to consider for the marathon.
I think to that point, I'll take a moment just to talk a little bit about Neversecond's range and our intention as a brand. One of the things that we're trying to do fundamentally is, when speaking a little bit, referring back to a little bit earlier, we talked about, historically, a lot of the brands are telling athletes to take a product. So they're very much product driven. Take a gel, take a drink. The questions become, well, when and how much? And fundamentally, at the granular level, you have to look at what's the composition of the products. All the Neversecond products are designed on the same composition of 2-to-1. Additionally, they're all built on 30-gram increments of carbohydrates. The idea is that this allows an athlete to easily calculate, test and then perfect their intake. So they know what works in advance of an event. And so I think that's an important distinction, is that we're not building products, we're really building a system of products. Currently, we have the drink mixes, C30 and C90. So the C reference, whether it's 30 or 90, refers to 30 grams of carbohydrate or 90 grams of carbohydrate. Our gels are C30s, theirs are 30 grams of carbohydrate. This allows athletes to basically mix and match and build a modular plan for themselves that really allows them to have a full range of different types of products. We do have later this year launching, we're very happy to announce the launch of our C30 Fuel Bar, which is fundamentally a solid version of a 30-gram carbohydrate source. And that's something that we're really excited about. So the lead behind here is that we're fundamentally around a system of products, not just a product company. And that's fundamentally giving athletes a blueprint for success.
And actually that really, just to say a point there, Bill, that actually, you know, a lot of problems people get into is when they mix products, and there's a whole lot going on there. You know, they have even if it's sort of different gels or a gel in a different drink when you're mixing brands, actually, you know, and especially if you do have a sensitive, you know, GI system, actually sticking with the same composition simplifies your fueling strategy and actually makes the stomach feel a lot more settled.
Absolutely. And that's a lot to do with the foundation of these being able to be built on one another. Alex,
Yeah.
if I may too add into this, what are your thoughts with caffeine, and when would you include that?
Yeah, that's something that's really, really important, because I think, you know, some people are really into their caffeine and will take every single product, will be a caffeine gel, and it'll be caffeine throughout the whole way. But I think ideally you want to be strategic with your caffeine intake. You have to remember that to sort of reach peak concentration in your system, it takes about 45 minutes for that caffeine to really sort of hit peak levels. So ideally, you know, for example, in my last marathon that I did, I think I had, so I took, I think it was my second to last gel. So that really sort of hit just at the time that I wanted to. So in that last sort of 40 minutes of the marathon, we all know is kind of like the first sort of 20 miles, isn't it? That last 6 miles of the marathon is like your first 20. So ideally you sort of want to plan your nutrition so that your caffeine can hit in at the point where you perceive that you're going to be struggling. And funnily enough, you know, when we do have a coffee or we have a caffeine gel, we do sort of instantly, don't we, almost sort of feel like, oh, that's brilliant, the caffeine's hit. But that's obviously a bit of a placebo effect, because it does, you know, the caffeine does start getting absorbed, but you're not going to get the peak effect until sort of maybe 45 minutes after you've taken it. So it's about planning it and being strategic as to where you want that caffeine to help you.
That's a great point. A lot of athletes talk about taking them in the very later stages of a race. And I was talking to Oscar about that, and he was like, well, yeah, it's generally hitting in after they're done. So it's something just to be aware of for a lot of athletes who think that it's immediate. So the number is around 40, you said about 45 minutes, Alex. Yeah,
approximately. I mean, again, it's very individual, and you know, like I always say to my athletes, well, if we got you into a lab, it might look, you know, and we actually really tested it, it might be slightly different for you, but we can't get everyone into the lab. So we have to kind of go by our sort of generic guidelines. So yeah, I think it's approximately 45 minutes.
Okay. Now just talking a little bit about the when an athlete should take carbohydrate during fueling. I think some great advice here. Some athletes will come to us and say, oh, when I take a C90 mix, should I drink the entire bottle at one time? I mean, maybe you could talk a little bit about consistency, which I think is a really important point to take home.
So I think this is definitely something that a lot of runners potentially get wrong, is that they start fueling too late. So lots of people might wait until they feel like they need it. So it might be sort of after an hour, maybe an hour and a half. And they might feel like, okay, I'm feeling a bit low now, so better start taking my carbohydrate. But, you know, what we want to do is, and as this sort of graph shows, is that over time, your glycogen stores get used. So if I took, you know, a gel now or ate a banana, my body's going to use that circulating glucose. It's going to use the available energy that I've just given it. So then, you know, that's what it's going to use. But if in a marathon, if we're not giving our body carbohydrates from external sources, it's going to use carbohydrate from our stores, which is fine, because that's what it's there for, you know, is to use if we don't have, you know, available energy. So it uses a glycogen that we have stored. But we kind of want to save that for as long as we can. We don't want to sort of dip into that, because once that's gone, it's gone. You're not going to get that back. So ideally we want to start as early as possible. So sort of within the first 20, 30 minutes, we probably want to be taking our first gel or our first drink, and then carrying on at regular intervals. And again, that's where the plan comes into. Well, if you're planning on taking 90 grams an hour, well, you might then have to take a gel every 20 minutes. If you've decided on 60 grams an hour, you'll take a 30-gram gel every half an hour. Mm-hmm. But also, the earlier on you take it, the body can obviously process and utilize that carbohydrate a lot easier. And your ability to process carbohydrate as you go into the marathon actually reduces, which is why the further on we get into it, we might get GI problems, we might feel a bit nauseous, because the further into exercise we go, the more blood is diverted away from the gut. It's called like gut ischemia, and it's going to the working muscles. So if we have a reduction of blood to our gut, then our gut's not going to be able to process that carbohydrate as easily. So we kind of want to get one step ahead with this fueling and get going when we're fresh. And hopefully, if everything goes to plan, you'll be able to take it throughout the whole marathon. Fingers crossed.
The lesson here is start early, stay consistent, and that's
key
message.
But also be flexible, and actually that's a really, really important message, because we have this plan, but you need to be flexible, because if any of you run a marathon, you can be feeling great at mile 18, and then 3 miles later, you're feeling like you literally don't want to run another step. And as any marathon runner knows, it can happen really quickly. For reasons sometimes we can't explain. It just happens, right? It's happened to all of us.
Absolutely.
So you have to be flexible. So we have to have this plan, and we have to know what we're going to do, but we need to be flexible. So I've experienced, 3 miles into a marathon in fact, it was earlier. I think it was about 2 miles in. I just had a bit of a dip. I felt really low, and I thought, oh God, I feel like I need a gel. And I was starting to think in my mind, well, I'm not meant to be having one for another sort of 15, 20 minutes, like I shouldn't. And then I remember we've got to be flexible, and we've got to respond to sometimes what our body's telling us.
That's great advice. Super advice. Okay, so we've talked about fuel, and let's talk a little bit about fluid intake. Maybe walk us through this slide.
So planning your fluids, we all know that dehydration can cause a decrease in performance. That's common knowledge. That's not new to anyone, I don't think. But I think probably people, runners panic about dehydration. I think it's something that runners worry about. And I think also runners worry about it because it is actually, it's not the easiest thing to do, to take on fluid whilst you're running. We've all been in races where you're handed the cups of water or your cups, and no matter how many times you do it, you still end up sort of trying to drink it down. It goes everywhere. It then causes panic because you're meant to be hydrating, but you can't quite. So we've all been there. But actually, I think the information I'm going to tell you all is probably going to make you feel a little bit more relaxed about it, because our fluid intake doesn't have to match our sweat rate exactly. I'll go into this in a little bit more detail in a minute. So the amount of fluid we lose, we don't have to then, replace it with the exact same amount. And also, again, like we said, don't confuse your fuel, which is your carbohydrate, with fluid. They're two very separate things.
I think that's a great point about the, the reality of not having to replace everything you sweat out, because that is a point of where it almost creates this thing, this climate of overconsumption, right? Where athletes are like, running around with bottles of water as if, they're just taking such copious amounts of fluids into.
Yeah. And I think, if we're talking about sweat rate, so, if you go online, there'll be lots of different sort of calculators you can use for sweat rate. But additionally, if you just want to keep it simple, if you weigh yourself before you run and weigh yourself after your run, so do a 60-minute run where you do a naked weight before, naked weight afterwards, you will sort of see, so let's say, for example, I go out for a run before and I'm 60 kilos and I come back and I'm 59 kilos. I know I've approximately lost 1 kilo, and that's approximate like 1 litre of fluid. Approximate, okay? We're not going on exact, but it's approximate. So that doesn't mean then for me to run a good marathon, I need to then take in 1,000 mils of 1 litre of water an hour, because that's impossible anyway. That's a hell of a lot of fluid to take. So one of the next slide will show, we can allow for 2% of weight loss. Like, we're not going to have, a decrease in performance if we lose a little bit of weight. So sort of 2 to 3% loss of body weight is acceptable when we perform. So that obviously just shows sort of sweat rate liters per hour.
Mm-hmm. I see, yeah. So that's kind of a target. Fundamentally, I guess the takeaway is don't overthink it. You'll lose some weight. It's good to figure out your sweat rate, I think, and it's not overly complicated to do, and it's something that you don't necessarily need to replace everything that you're sweating.
Yeah. Okay. So if we look at the next slide, and then it shows that it quite nicely. So if we have a look here, I'm pointing, you can't see what I'm pointing at, the one that says the sweat rate. So let's say, for example, your sweat rate is sort of in total sort of 3.6 litres. So it's 1.2 litres per hour. So you work out that, in an hour's run, you've lost, 1.2 litres of water. So then you work out, right, well, I'm going to hopefully do a 3-hour marathon. So I times that by 3. So you'll see down at the bottom the calculation. So that's 3.6 litres for your marathon. But then if we allow for that sort of percentage of body weight that we can lose without knowing we're going to reduce performance, that's the equivalent of 1.5 kilos. So that's the equivalent of 1.5 litres. So really we're looking at, over a 3-hour marathon, we're looking at about 2 litres of water, which then equates to about 700 mils per hour, which is still quite, it's not like it's a tiny amount, but it's a lot more doable amount than 1.2 litres an hour, which I think a lot of people might perceive they would need to replace.
Well, if you think about it, if a lot of athletes are also using on-course water stops, and realistically, I don't know what the average is, but I've talked to a number of professionals, and they usually can manage about 3 to 4 ounces of, that's all they can get down. So that when you put out the total numbers and the space between the water stops, 700 ml is feasible. The other just isn't really.
It is feasible, but again, it is a tricky thing to practice, because even if we practice in training and we set ourselves up like a 5-mile loop and we're leaving out bottles and we can run around and we pick up our bottle and we do that in training, that's still not replicating running with thousands and thousands and thousands of runners all trying to get to those water stations and grab the bottles. It can be quite stressful, I think, when you get into there's loads of people there. So it is a tricky thing to replicate, I think, the hydration. And I would say potentially it's probably the one thing that most people might not achieve to plan. But additionally, the body is a lot more robust, I think, with regards sort of flex with hydration needs than people realize.
Okay, fantastic. Let's see here. Oh, I figured, because there's so much discussion around electrolytes and this kind of almost an overemphasis on electrolytes, might be a good space just to talk a little bit about our thoughts and your thoughts on electrolytes and their importance, specifically, I guess, within longer running, but then specifically within the marathon.
Yeah.
What are your overall perspectives on electrolyte consumption?
I mean, it's really interesting, because I think electrolytes is something that I find people tend to think about before carbohydrate. I'll quite often say, or people say, well, yeah, I take on a drink, it's got this electrolyte tab in. I'll say, well, has it got carbohydrate in? No, it's just electrolyte. So it's funny. I think it seems to be sort of the initial go-to that people think about when they're thinking about sort of running and fueling and hydrating. But remaining focused on the marathon, because we're not talking about anything that's probably going to be longer than the marathon today. the need for electrolytes is very much overhyped. You know, you'll hear a lot of people going to the extremes of maybe thinking of taking salt tabs, making sure they're taking extra electrolytes. But actually, the body's a lot more resilient than I think a lot of people tend to think. And we have, you know, incredible abilities to keep the body regular and stable when it comes down to electrolytes. You know, we do also have, you know, sodium stores in our body, which a lot of people don't realize that we have. So I think dehydration is definitely a bigger issue than salt loss. Dehydration can cause, you know, much more of a problem than losing too much salt. And a lot of the products like the gels and the drinks do have, you know, some sodium in, like the Neversecond products, which actually is going to be plenty, you know, for running a marathon. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, of course. It's something that we do constantly get questions around electrolytes. So thanks for explaining that a bit. We do see it, to your point, hear about it and are asked about it every day consistently. And there's definitely this misunderstanding and confusion with a lot of consumers about its importance. They also talk about all of the electrolytes. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about sodium and its importance relative to the other electrolytes. Is there maybe a hierarchy in terms of just kind of helping people understand where the relevancy, when you talk about electrolytes, like what is actually important?
Well, I tend to think, you know, the sodium is the most important thing compared to the other electrolytes. We've got like potassium and chloride and magnesium. So, you know, they're all important electrolytes. You know, they all have their need and their role in the body. But, you know, it tends to be the sodium that is the most important electrolyte, because that helps keep that fluid balance within the body. And I think also, you know, an important point is when we do run, you know, people will actively taste and feel or sometimes see the salt on their face and on their bodies, which I think puts people into naturally more of a panic that there's been this massive loss and there's going to be a massive decrease in performance because they're losing so much sodium. But, you know, most products do have a small amount in and should be enough to keep you sort of well and performing well.
Fair enough. Understood. So now that we've planned, put together a fueling plan and a fluid plan, the next step is about determining your protocol. Could you maybe walk the audience through that a little bit?
So if you've gone through everything that we've done, so steps 1, 2, and 3, it's about sort of sitting down, writing your plan, and actually putting down what you're going to do. So you've selected the right products for you, taking into account how much fuel you need, how much fluid you need, and also what your preferences are going to be. And then making sure that your plan is practical, that it's going to be usable within the marathon. And, you know, the main thing is that you can tolerate it. But also it's about making sure that even if you have this initial plan, if after a few weeks it's not working, you can keep revising it. So it's like training. You need to train, you need to see if it works. If it doesn't, you need to revise it. It might be that the product's not right for you, so you maybe need to try another product. So it's about getting your plan, but now putting it into place, which we'll talk about, I think in the next slide, about how we get into practicing and training your guts. We can train our guts, you know, our gut, like we can train our muscles, we can train our guts. And I think it's something that a lot of people don't realize. But it takes practice and more practice and more practice. And as Lauren said, even practice outside of the marathon training block can get you to tolerate the carbohydrates. So if we've got a 12-week training block, you want to make sure that you're training your gut at least once a week and using your intended race day product. So essentially that's probably going to be your long run, and increasing your intake weekly. So if, depending on what stage you're at, so if you're new to fueling, like we said earlier on, to start small and build up. So if your aim is going to be 60 grams, you might want to start at half a gel an hour. And build it up. But you can also use shorter runs. So if you do have less time, you can also use shorter runs. So let's say you're doing a 60-minute run or a 90-minute run, just to start getting your body used to the taste, getting used to actually taking the product. So it doesn't have to just be on your long run. If you do want to take it out on a shorter run just to start getting used to it, then you can do that as well. But ideally, you want to be hitting your race day target, I would say, at least for your last sort of 4 long runs, at least, minimum.
So I was going to say, it's very similar to training, where you want to definitely be replicating as close as you can to doing it more than once. You want to do it a few times before race day.
Yeah, for sure.
It's a little bit more on gut training. I know we've addressed most of this, but I think there's some really good points in this slide which talk about the temptations that people have. Lauren and I were just at the Miami Marathon, and there were a lot of decisions made about tomorrow's race today, meaning a lot of athletes were saying, hey, I'm going to try this gel because it's great and I'm going to use it tomorrow. It happened more often than not. Of course, that's not the advice we're giving, is not to do that, but you know, ultimately people are going to make their own the decisions that they feel are in their best interest. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how people should approach you know, the idea about on-course nutrition. Is it, if for instance, does it make sense for them to, for instance, look up what the nutrition is going to be provided on course and train with that? Is that kind of a recommendation that we would make?
Well, I think if you want things to be easy and you don't want to be carrying your own nutrition, then for sure you're going to use the nutrition on the course, because they'll have the gels, they'll have the drinks. So you don't have to worry about carrying your own nutrition. So you can find that out and you can train with it yourself. But obviously, if you want to use your own brand, the gels are easy. Probably if you wanted to use the drinks, then you would have to carry it yourself during the race. But whatever the product is, you have to get your gut used to it. So it's about using your intended product maybe 1 to 2 times a week. But also another really, really important thing is you've got to remember that even in training, you're still not 100% replicating race day, because you're not going to train out at marathon pace in training. So what I really recommend is making sure that you're taking that nutrition on times when you're feeling fatigued. So that might be in a long run where you've got maybe some 5K marathon pace reps, or you've got a progression long run, so that you're actually taking the gels, not in those sort of slower, steady parts of those runs, but you're taking the gels or the drink in those higher intensity part of the long runs. Also, if you're doing a half marathon, you know, because obviously a half marathon, you're going to be working at a higher intensity. So practicing taking on your gels in the half marathon, because that's just going to replicate and get you to take nutrition and carbohydrates at a higher intensity and when your body is feeling more fatigued, because essentially that becomes a difficult bit in the marathon. Also, you know, looking actually how much carbohydrate you're having day to day. You know, if you typically have quite a low carbohydrate diet, which of course isn't desirable if you're training for a marathon, but that's going to potentially affect your ability to use and utilize carbohydrate during running. So you might want to look at making sure you're increasing your carbohydrate on a day-to-day basis as well.
Okay, that's great advice. On our final slide, before we dive into the Q&A, we have a lot of questions for you and for us coming. So, but the last slide we have is about carb loading. You and I talked about this a little bit. Maybe you could talk the audience a little bit through kind of the do's and don'ts of carb loading. I think a lot of our audience may have in their mind this giant plate of pasta that's twice what they normally eat the night before. Maybe you could talk a little bit about maybe what they should do and what they shouldn't do, or what type of moderation how they should approach it the day before and the days before.
I mean, some people revel on the fact that leading up to a marathon, they can start eating loads of carbohydrate and eat as much as they want. And if that's what they can do and they want to do, then that's what works for them. But I think there's also a factor you've got to remember is that it's not going crazy. It's not sort of having huge amounts in plates of pasta, as you said, Bill, because you've got to remember as well, you do taper. So leading up to a marathon, if you're following a proper plan, you know, you will have a 2-week taper, which means that you're training less and your glycogen stores will naturally replenish a bit better, because obviously you're not using up as much energy because you're training less. So that's naturally going to help. But also, you know, just a couple of days before, just increasing your carbohydrate a little bit. Now, you might find that easy, and I work with some athletes that have no problem increasing the amount of pasta they're having or increasing the amount of oats they're having. But I do have a lot of athletes that say they really struggle, and it's not something that makes them feel comfortable. It's not something they can do. They might not have a huge appetite. They might be anxious leading up to the race. So
does some of it have to do with, Alex, whether it's whole grain type, or like oats, or would refined carbohydrates maybe be easier?
So it depends. I mean, if you have, we advise that if somebody has sort of sensitive GI system and they're prone to GI issues when they run, then we kind of advise reducing the fiber leading up to the marathon. So you might go for sort of white rice, things like Rice Krispies. So you avoid sort of the higher fiber foods. You know, you don't go for loads of fruit and vegetables. But if you don't have a sensitive GI tract, you don't need to strip out all the fiber from your diet, because you don't want to make drastic dietary changes. So you might be a little bit more aware. You might think, well, I won't go out for a curry, or I might avoid like a, really fatty fish and chips the night before. But you want to try and keep things as routine as you can. And so, if you do struggle increasing the amount of carbohydrate, things like sort of supplementing with liquid fuel. So like you might take, if we're looking at the Neversecond product, you might take some C30, a couple of bottles of that during the day. You might have some higher energy bars, so smaller volume, but higher energy. So you just need to increase it as well as you can, but you don't want to be pushing it beyond being uncomfortable, because you don't want it to negatively affect your race. So yes, it's important to increase your carbs, because we want to have full tank of petrol, or fuel, before we go, but not to the expense of drastic changes.
Yeah, simply doing it. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, it's all great advice, Alex. I thank you so much for giving us so much of this great information. We have a lot of questions now from our audience. Just due to timing, I know it's relatively late in Europe. We'll probably have time for about 10 of the questions out of the 20. And if you do have additional questions in our audience, feel free to enter them into the chat, and we can respond to you offline as well. But let's get after it here. We've got a bunch of questions. Let's see here. First question is, Scott Murray asks, he'd be interested in knowing any post-recovery strategies for marathon.
So after the marathon, I generally think it depends on what your plan is afterwards. So if you are doing a marathon and you've got 2-3 weeks, maybe longer, of just relaxed training, a bit of time off, which a lot of marathon runners do, then really, I think, even though maybe sort of the science might see something different, but, eating what you want and what you can tolerate is fine, because you're not heading straight back into another training block. But if you're heading into another training block within a week, which some athletes do, then getting on nutrition is really important. Now, I think a lot of people commonly don't have much of an appetite after they race, especially if you race hard. So you've got to think, what's the easiest way of getting nutrition in? So I think having things like recovery drinks is really important, but making sure you're not just having like a protein shake. You've got to make sure that carbohydrate is a priority. So as soon as you finish, you can put the powder into a water bottle, shake it up, that can get you going. So it's about thinking about what carbohydrate you're going to tolerate and be able to eat as easily as possible as soon as you've finished. Ideally, you want to be having a proper meal within an hour. But again, that depends if your appetite dictates. So I think depending on what your appetite is, but sometimes liquid recovery can be really effective.
Well, that's good. That's good advice. Thanks so much for that. On the flip side, we have another question from Mariana Daldos, who asks, what is the best pre-race strategy in the hour before. What do you recommend the hour before your event?
So the hour before, you don't want to be doing too much, because there's this risk that if you eat at the wrong time, potentially you're going to sort of shoot your blood sugar level up, you're going to have a release of insulin. And then if you time that wrong, there's potentially, when you start exercising, your blood sugar level is going to go down. So it's something called rebound hypoglycemia. Now, some people don't suffer from that. I've never experienced it, but some people do, and that can have a really negative effect on like your first mile into the marathon. So essentially, you want to be having a good meal sort of 3 hours before the marathon. So good carbohydrate, making sure you're eating enough. If you have a snack, maybe sort of 70, 80 minutes before, that might work well for you. So you might have a bar or a banana. But a really good tip is maybe having a gel sort of 10 to 15 minutes before the start line. So additionally, nerves are terrible, aren't they, before you race? And actually trying to get something to eat that close to racing is really hard. So that's why I think taking a gel, it's perfect timing, and also it's very easy to take. So 10 to 15 minutes, or when you're on that start line, take your gel, because that's going to get you primed and ready to go. That's
perfect. Thanks so much, Alex. We have a question. This one, I always requires a couple reviews for re-reviews. Maybe you can run through how to do sweat rate testing again. One of our audience members is saying, can you just run through that quickly for?
Well, it's a shame I don't have a calculation, but I can't keep the numbers and the actual formula in my mind. I'm sure if Askell was here, he could, but my brain can't retain that information. But a really simple way of doing it is if you weigh yourself before you run. So naked weight, do an hour run, then weigh yourself afterwards. So it's approximately, for every kilo lost, it's approximately equates to about a litre of water. So that's how you can approximate. And, you know, it's interesting to do it if you're doing it different times of the year, as to sort of obviously environment, you know, how fast you run can affect how much fluid you lose. But that's the basic. But if you take a look, and you know, I know on Asker's website, on My Sports Science, there's, you know, a great article about sweat rate, and we'll show you exactly how to formulate that with lots of numbers.
Okay, let's got time for maybe 3 more questions. Trying to sort through them here. See here. Talked about recovery strategy. I'm looking through the questions, and it looks to me like you've answered just about all of them. So,
wow.
Yeah, I was going to say that most of the questions are. Well, here's one that's. Is there anything that you recommend to avoid cramps? A lot of runners complain of cramps. What is the root source of cramps, and what do you recommend?
So cramps is always, and I'm sure you will have heard it, Bill, people always blame electrolytes. Mm-hmm. It just seems to be like the common thing. I get cramp, it's because I've lost salt. But actually, the evidence behind that is really, really not convincing. And quite often, cramping can be more of a muscular strength fatigue issue. Cramping tends to occur for most people in a race and at certain points of races. So that might be the point that you've not pushed your training to, for example. So you might be getting cramping in the last 6 miles of your marathon, whereas a lot of people might only train up to 20 miles in their training runs. So again, there's nothing sort of particularly firm or firm evidence as to sort of what, you know, there's no definite answer, but it's not necessarily electrolytes, and it's probably more to do with conditioning. Okay,
that's great answer. I know Lauren gets cramps a lot too, so she's, I'm sure, listening in. She gets cramps a lot.
Conditioning.
Yeah, sorry.
We have time for one more question. Listen, I guess it speaks to the fluid and fuel question. How much water do you recommend by taking a gel? I think it really speaks to the idea of when you consider and calculate your fluid intake. Neversecond gels are obviously more of a thinner viscosity. They have more water in them than some of the other gels on the market. Should you calculate in your total fluid intake? Should you be thinking about your gels, or should you be thinking of your gels purely as an energy source?
Yeah, I definitely think, I mean, I've never even considered counting gels as part of fluid. Okay. They're definitely separate. Your carbohydrate and then your hydration.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, Alex. Before we, I think that we answered just about every question that we had. I'm just going to put back on screen share and share a little bit more information with our audience before heading off for the evening. Want to talk a little bit about what is coming up at Neversecond. Let's see here. You can see my screen okay, I assume. Mm-hmm. So we're very excited to be launching 2 new products in the foreseeable future in the first 2 quarters of 2023. As we talked about earlier in the webinar today, we talked about our C30 Fuel Bar that is launching in April of 2023. As with our other C-Series products, the Fuel Bar uses 30 grams of carbohydrate. It is a 2-to-1 fuel source and is very low in fat, fiber, and protein. The reason we do that is to those nutrients are generally impede carbohydrate absorption. So the idea behind coming up with an outstanding bar is one that is a high performance bar. We feel the C30 bar is definitely going to be one that endurance athletes should be looking out for when they're looking for a high quality performance bar. We also have launching, as we near summer, our C30 Ice Gel. The C30 Ice Gel is, we started introducing it last year at the Tour de France. What it is essentially is it is a 30-gram carbohydrate gel, which can be taken either in ambient or it can also be frozen to form an icy slush. We find that this product will be especially beneficial for endurance athletes performing at high heat, because it's going to not only provide the incremental energy that the athletes need, but it's also going to be able to provide some level of physiological, but also a psychological cooling effect for the athletes as well. We expect that will be launched in May or June 2023. On a final note, we have our guidance system launching in 2023. That will be launching both online at neversecond.com. We'll also be launching it with a variety of retailers, both in Europe as well as in the US. In addition to Latin America. This will allow consumers to enter a retail location, scan with the QR code with their phone, and be given a quiz where they'll answer a series of questions and be given specific fueling guidance using Neversecond products. So those are, again, 3 new developments that are happening in 2023 that we're super excited about. On a final note, I wanted to share with the audience information about getting in touch that we feel is really critical. First, I wanted to provide Alex Cook's information. Alex, I wanted to say thanks again so much for helping us today, and you've done such a fantastic job in really demystifying a lot of the questions that come up with marathon training and competing. Alex consults one-on-one with a variety of athletes. We provided her both her website, the sportsdietitian.co.uk, as well as her email address and her Instagram, in case you want to get in touch with Alex. Likewise, I'm posting Neversecond's information, which is both our website. You can reach out to us with any questions that you have outstanding from the webinar at hello@never2.com. You can also follow us on YouTube, and our Instagram is listed as well for your reference. Thank you so much for your time again, Alex. It's been an absolute pleasure. Do you have anything you'd like to add before signing off?
No, just good luck in your spring marathons.
Race
well and practice well.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Alex. Good luck, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks again. Bye now.
Bye.